Disney's Star Wars, The Mandalorian, and Grogu's the next entry some 7 years after the rise of Skywalker for Kathleen Kennedy's Lucasfilm, but this one to be helmed, of course, by Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni. Now looks like it has a new production home after the state of California lobbed a metric ton of money in tax credits at the production to keep it home. The funny thing is, they may not even have the Mandalorian signed up to do it yet. Renegade Online. Well, folks, welcome back. Another great day here at Valiant Renegade. It's good to see everybody out there once again. And if you are like one of the many folks watching this video, not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment and turn that little red subscribe button to gray. Hit that like button, hit that notification bell, share this sucker out on the social medias, and of course, please do leave a comment before you head out the door today. Make sure to join us every Sunday afternoon at 6 p.m. Eastern right here for the live show. Well, this is an interesting one and a bit of a rarity to get this much news this early on in a production, especially one that's not in the United Kingdom. We'll talk about why, but this from Deadline magazine. The Mandalorian and Grogu lands one of California's largest tax credit awards ever, the first Star Wars flick to be shot entirely in the Golden State. The Star Wars franchise is coming to shoot a film entirely in California for the first time with the Mandalorian and Grogu movie, and the Golden State is paying out its weight in tax incentive gold to have the Bounty Hunter saga made within state lines. To be specific, that total tonnage is $21.755 million in conditional tax credits for the Jon Favreau-directed film. With a new Fantastic Four, Gladiator 2, and a new season of The Last of Us on his dance card, it's unclear right now if SAG Award winner Pedro Pascal will be resuming his role of Din Djarin and teaming back up with the charming Baby Yoda for the Mandalorian movie. So apart from having to break down the tax credits, somebody needs to give a call over to the Blue Oyster Club and find out where Pedro is, because apparently Disney has no idea. But of course, over the last few seasons of The Mandalorian, we've learned that Pedro Pascal was maybe none too happy with the shooting conditions and the fact that he was constantly being masked during the entire show. God forbid that's what the character actually requires. But then again, there have been a lot of stand-ins for Pedro Pascal, stunt doubles and whatnot, with Pedro doing much of the voice acting work in post. But apparently right now, Pedro's not involved, at least not officially insofar as Deadline magazine can tell. And with a very aggressive production schedule for this film and a desperate attempt to reinvigorate the Star Wars box office, there's no word yet on whether Pedro's schedule is going to allow him to actually be in that costume during principal photography. What is known is that the $21.7 million in tax credits is one of the biggest allocations in the California Film Commission run's program's history. Put another way, The Mandalorian and Grogu won't be getting the $22.4 million that the Transformers spinoff Bumblebee scored back in 2017, but it tops the more than $20.8 million that Captain Marvel was awarded 7 years ago. Now here's the kicker, folks. From the article, estimated to be hiring 500 crew members, 54 cast members, and 3,500 background players for 92 filming days in California this year, The Mandalorian and Grogu is expected to generate a record-breaking $166,438,000 in qualified expenditures and below-the-line wages. So let's break that down a bit, because that seems to suggest that as of right now, before anything in principal photography has actually commenced, that Disney has already slated a $200-some-odd million total budget to this film, in an era where Disney has been talking about bringing back some of these production budgets. But I guess they're willing to go all in on a Star Wars movie because there has been such an absence of them for the last 6 to 7 years by the time this one comes out. $166 million or so in qualified expenses would be expenses that meet the criteria for the film tax credit in the state of California, with some receiving more or less of a film tax credit depending on what that expense is. But the expenses that are not included, or the expenses that would not be below the line, would be things like producers, executive producers, the director, Jon Favreau, or how about the head writer, and of course, the principal cast, people like Pedro Pascal, if he actually signs up to be in the costume, or even as a principal voice actor. He's going to be credited as the Mandalorian himself. Anybody else that would be in this that would also have principal status as an actor would not be considered below the line. So if you can imagine that there's probably at least another $30 to $40 million of expenses that don't qualify for the film tax credit, that's where we come up with a budget of at least $200 million. And you know what we've said about budgets before, especially when it comes to Disney. A budget is just a budget. It's a plan to spend this much money. And that's why there's a conditional $21 million or so in film tax credits from the state of California, because that's based on, or rather it's being escrowed aside for Disney, provided that they actually spend that much in the production itself. Now, that could go higher, it could come in lower, depending on what the Walt Disney Company actually shells out to complete production of this film, and of course, if those expenses meet the criteria. But time will tell. But we all seem to know that Disney's budgets versus what they actually spend on producing a film in the end are often two very, very different numbers. Part of the reason we know that is thanks to our friends at Forbes magazine like Caroline Reed. Star Wars The Force Awakens becomes the most expensive movie ever made. And I want to remind folks that originally Disney slated the budget for that, at least publicly, at around $250 million. What they actually spent was closer to $560 million, more than double what they suggested that the budget was. The reason that people like Caroline and Forbes get that information is because when these movies are shot in the United Kingdom, there are typically additional reporting requirements compared to many other locations that would offer film tax credits, like a full-fledged financial accounting that is made publicly available. And Caroline, over the years, has pulled a lot of those financial returns in the UK to find out what the actual dollars and cents were, or at least in that case, how many British pound sterlings were dropped to produce these films. In California, those reporting requirements are a little bit different, and oftentimes we don't see a lot of the data that comes in because it's not every expense that is produced. Whereas in the UK, typically the entire production is made publicly available. But to be sure, the state of California is desperate to get business back into its home state, especially big business like Disney Productions, following 8 to 9 months of nothing happening in the state of California with the film industry, thanks to the strikes by the WGA and SAG-AFTRA. And maybe, just maybe, Disney was more than happy to try to bring it home because there would be a little bit less scrutiny and maybe a little bit more privacy in terms of what they finally spend on this film. Now, we should know within a few years how much Disney spent, at least to get a film tax credit, based on how much of a tax credit they get back from the state of California, presuming that the entire movie does end up being shot there. So if the film tax credit goes above the $21 million that is escrowed currently, then we'll get a rough idea of how much they may have gone over budget. And we'll certainly be keeping an eye peeled to see what that is. It also makes me wonder if keeping production in California might not make it easier for Pedro Pascal to be a bit more of a participant as the Mandalorian himself, as opposed to just being in a recording booth for a voiceover. Either way, this is a big gamble for the Walt Disney Company, spending this much money on a movie that may or may not do well at the box office. This has got to be a banger, but once again, as we continue to remind folks, movies like this are inherently a risk when they're coming off of, frankly, a very soft third season that's leading into it in this particular case. Mando Season 1 and 2, big hits. Mando Season 3, well, the audience shrank considerably thanks to things like The Book of Boba Fett, which soured a lot of fans, myself admittedly included. So I don't know how well that goodwill is going to carry into going back to the box office, because this movie is probably going to need, like most other big Disney productions of the last few years, somewhere around $800 million just to strike a break-even point in the box office, because it's going to wind up on Disney Plus once again and nowhere else, meaning no revenue from Netflix, no revenue from Amazon Prime, and quite frankly, a likely much more limited PVOD or premium video on demand sales revenue, more likely compressed physical media revenue because of the immediacy that this thing usually hits with streaming when it comes to Disney titles. We'll see what happens. Disney's typically got to make their nut back in the box office if they want to see real cash flows, and this one's going to be a challenge, I think. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, take care. Make sure you're subscribed to Valiant Renegade and join us every Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the live show.